Good evening and welcome to our Diversity and Transformation in the Workplace webinar. I'm your host, Stephanie Dahan, and I'm the Events and Content Manager for SACAP. In a blog by Dr. Loudon Martin on the power of psychological safety, the following question is posed. Have you ever been in a team where you felt too afraid to voice your opinions or ideas, fearing judgment or negative consequences? This evening, Gluckman and Veronica will expand on the need for diversity, equity, inclusion, and psychological safety in the workplace. They'll also take us through practical steps as to how we can become a part of the solution daily. Now, without any further ado, I'll now hand over to Roy.
Thank you so much. I'm not giving any practical steps in mine, unfortunately. I am unfortunately coming with way more questions than I am answers today. So that's why I'm going to kind of kick off and just give us some like theoretical, esoteric, maybe even psychological things for us to think about as to where this fits in. So thank you so much for inviting me. My name is Roy Gluckman. If you're wondering, who is this white boy doing diversity work and why does he look exhausted? Well, it's Pride Month, which means that everyone wants to learn everything about the gays in 15 minutes at one time, and it must just be going. So it's a lot of energy in June for me. But in a nutshell, I've been doing diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging work for over a decade now. And it really started in university. So I grew up in a family, in a typical white South African family, perhaps, for its time, that kind of said to me, Roy, you're the wrong race, you're the wrong gender. You need to get out of South Africa. There's no opportunities for you, right? Whiteness is under threat, masculinity is under threat, and that's it. And that belief system entered into my consciousness, into my belief system without me even knowing it. So I went down to UCT, I studied law, and in one of our modules called Constitutional Law and Human Rights, there I am having to learn about our constitution, human dignity, social justice, equality. And I'm listening to this lecture and he's like, hey, by the way, equality is social justice and about redistribution. And I'm like, no, it's not. It's apartheid in reverse. It's reverse discrimination. And this tension, this battle between very compelling academic knowledge that I'd never received before and an internal embodied experience of like, no, this isn't what I believe. And me then saying, but wait, where did these beliefs come from? And me saying, I don't know. I think my parents are like, but when did I get these challenged? And I was like, I didn't. And I'm 23 and I'm only thinking about this now. And that was the start of me doing this work. That was literally the turning point where it kind of called me to say, go create spaces for people who look, think, and feel like you, to have similar experiences, hopefully. And this is the work I've been doing. And it's evolved and it's constantly evolving. And today I'm here to kind of talk to you about stuff which I love, okay? And it's kind of thinking about what's next in this conversation. What's next, where the blockage is. And this is going to be a really, really wonderful session, not for you to take notes necessarily. So sit back, take a breath. I don't need you to think hard. I just want you to be present and just like play with some of these concepts with me, right? I'm coming with way more questions than I am answers. And the big question essentially that I'm answering or asking is, what comes first? Belonging or psychological safety? And where does this fit in? Let's kind of have a look at this quickly. When I started doing this work, it was diversity, right? Diversity training. That's what we did. And then it's like, okay, let's do unconscious bias training. Okay, we go do unconscious bias training. And it's like, oh, it's not just about diversity. It's about inclusion. Yes, it's about bringing differences. It's not just about black faces and gay faces and women faces. It's actually about how do we come together in the organization. Ah, great. That's inclusion. Good. Go for inclusion. And we did inclusion training. It was great and great and great. And then it was like, oh, hold on a second. There's an equality or an equity component. Well, at the time, it was an equality component. We need to actually think about fairness and justice. Is it justice? Oh, it's actually not equality, it's equity. Yes, it's equity. Oh, everyone goes and does equity work. And it's kind of been this interesting movie, you know, this evolution of our understanding of this work within organizations and within ourselves. And then early last year, late year before that, we started to talk about this idea of belonging. Oh, it's not equity and inclusion now, it's belonging. Right, everyone now must do belonging training. And what's been quite fascinating and somewhat humorous is that we see this, and organizations see this as linear. We do diversity training, then we do inclusion, then we do equity, then we do belonging. And now everyone's talking about psychological safety. Oh, okay, now we have to have psychological safety. Here's the reality. All of this is the same thing. All of it is the same thing. We're talking about power. We're talking about history. We're talking about access. We're talking about comfort. Psychological safety is not a new concept, right? That lovely quote that Stephanie read, like, I'm pretty sure we could have pulled an exact definition of what inclusion is to meet psychological safety. Psychological safety is an experience that people of color, women, queer people have felt their entire existence within organizations. It's not a new thing. Belonging is just because we now have a fancy word doesn't mean that it's a new experience we're trying to foster. There's always been a sense of not belonging, of being excluded, of not having access, of feeling unsafe. So what I'd love for us to look at today is to just pause for a moment, right? Just pause. D, E, I, B. Then we talk about psychological safety, and then justice, and then microaggressions. And where does this all fit into this picture? It's all one and the same. So what I'd love for us to think about today is to kind of look at this relationship between belonging and psychological safety. And in looking at the relationship between belonging and psychological safety, we're going to be thinking about the why of D&I, of DEI, right? Why are we doing this? What is the point? So as I'm going through the session, I kind of just want you to plug it into your own life. Like, where does this happen for you? Or where did this happen for you? Or what's happening in my body when Roy's asking me to do this, to think about this? I just kind of want you to check in as we talk about two very emotional, very sensitive concepts called belonging and psychological safety. They are not new, right? The wording might be fresh, but the experience in our body is old. The experience in our body and the trauma in our body is so old, our grandparents felt similar spaces, similar things, right, that we now inherited. It's old, it's ancient, it's old as humanity. And I want us to look at it maybe through different language, but in a bit of a fresh approach. So we're going to jump in. I want you to kind of take a big breath with me. I wonder if there was more for me and less for you, but let's jump in. Right. What is the importance of belonging? What is the need to belong? We as human beings are social. We get it. We understand it. We need to be in community. We need to be in partnership, in family, in organization, in team, in school, in neighborhood, in country, in world. This is who it is that we are as a species. We are communal. Now, this is, forget about introvert, extrovert, I'm alone at the extra, it means nothing, right? As human beings, we have a physiological and a biological need to belong. And what and why do we have this biological need, this draw to belong to something? Is because when we belong to the team, to the school, to the family, to the partner, to the organization, to the country, whatever it is, there is a sense of safety. There's a safety in numbers. We're in a group. We are together. We share. We have access. We pull in. This idea of safety is so critical, right? It's why animals have prides. This is everything about our experience as human beings in community is to feel safe. Because when we are in the group, we are safe, right? When we are out of the group, we might be less safe, okay? We might be less safe. So everything about society, humanity, is about belonging to feel safe. What's another aspect that drives our need to belong is because when we are in, when we belong and we feel safe, then we share in the access to resources and opportunities. When I am in, I feel safe because I have access to resources and opportunities. When I am out, I feel less safe. I am not going to have access to resources and opportunities. Think about the hyena outside of the lion kill, right? There is no sharing. There is animosity. Everything about the human experience and our need to belong is for us to feel safe and for us to have access to resources and opportunities. So maybe before it started off with a resource and opportunity for shelter, food, right? Maybe now it's shifted somewhat. Access to opportunities within workplaces, access to resources like mentorship and sponsorship. The currency may have changed, but the same need is there. What we need to understand and what's really interesting about belonging is that the need to belong to something, to a group, whether we want to or not, drives everything about our behavior, right? When I walk into a library, immediately I'm going to suss it out. I know that I need to behave in a certain way within the space in order to belong in the space, to have access to the books and to stay here within the space. If my behavior is loud and boisterous and I know that I'm going to be asked to leave. So I modify my behavior within that space, even if I'm a very loud person, in order to belong within the space. Then I go to the jungle gyms outside, I go to the playground, the park, and everything about that space communicates to me that I can be loud, right? I can modify my behavior in order to belong to the space. You and I are constantly modifying and shifting our behaviors in order to belong within spaces, within communities, within groups, right? Because that's where we feel safe. So everything about your and my behavior is driven by the need to belong. But I want us to ask a different question, a follow-up question. If the need to belong drives our behavior, right? We do certain behaviors to belong. What shapes our behavior? Which behaviors allow us to belong and which don't? So yes, in the library, I need to be quiet and respectful, cool. Who said that? Who determined the boundaries of which behaviors we need to demonstrate in order to belong? There are two dominant forces in this world. I want you to think about this for yourself. Here's a question. Two dominant forces that shape everything about society. Everything about society as we know it today is determined by two forces. What do you think those are? Take a moment to think about it. What are the two dominant forces that govern everything about society? Just take a moment to think about it. No right or wrong answers right now, and no one can really comment anyways. Just think about it. What are the two dominant forces? Love, hate, money, power. The two dominant forces, the two forces that control everything about how society operates, are you ready? Is reward and punishment. Everything about society, from how we raise our children, from how you were raised, from our school systems, from our churches, from our places of worship, from our organizations, from just being in society, in the world, in government, in this life, is controlled by reward and punishment. And when we're thinking about reward and punishment, it's not just this idea of money or a whip. They're often more subtle. When we're thinking about certain punishments, we're looking at discipline, right? So we think it can be physical, it can be psychological, all right? What about the idea of shame? To be shamed is a punishment, right? Shame from our family, shame from our community. What about to be excluded, to be pushed out? What about a disapproving look from a manager, a disapproving look from an auntie, a granny, a mom, an older brother? What about stuff like, let's just get it loading, disappointment, right? Disappointing our family, bringing shame. We don't want to do it. What about rejection? Is such a big punishment, right? Unrequited love, asking somebody out, they say no, is such a punishment on who it is that we are in terms of our behaviors. What about being alienated or being thrown out of the group? What about being ignored? What about being uninvited? What about being unfollowed, right? What about everything about this idea of punishment triggers within our body a danger, okay? That something is in danger. It's something that we feel within us, this idea of punishment, and it's very, very powerful. And then we look at rewards. It's not only just about monetary rewards and gifts. This is also part of it. We're looking at followers on our social media and on our other platforms, like people who listen to us and influence. We're thinking about the attention that we get. Oh, look, you're very beautiful. You look very beautiful tonight. Oh, all of these things that give us attention. What else have we got here? Just let it load. Give me a second. There we are. Privileges, right? The privilege that we get for good behavior. What about praise? What about recognition? What about affection from people? What about the likes that we get? What about the compliments that we get? Everything about reward, the gifts, is there to be celebrated. So everything about our world has been determined and has been created by two very powerful forces. What it is we reward and what it is that we punish. And much like lanes, it kind of keeps us in that lane, right? That's not what we do. Yes, this is what we do. We slightly nudge, we kind of moved in consistently. Everything about how it is we are in our families, in our schools, in life, in society, in our organizations is governed by the framework of reward and punishment. Very, very, very powerful, right? So what is it that reward and punishment creates or directs or nudges? It has everything to do with shaping our behavior. Don't reward this, punish that. Punish this, reward that, in order to make us good boys and girls, right? To make us good citizens, to make us good employees. Thinking about reward and punishment as shaping our identities. Girls don't wear that. No. Boys don't cry. That's not who we date. Oh, look at those two men kissing. No, that's gross, right? We have this. Oh, no, it shapes our identity. No, this is not what a good, this is, oh, you speak so beautifully. Everything about reward and punishment shapes how it is in the relationship we have with ourselves, who it is that we are, the aspects of ourselves. We mold it according to this idea and this framework of reward and punishment, to the jobs that we choose, to what it is that we wear, to what it is that and who it is that we want to marry, the food that we eat, the things that we buy, everything about your and my experience, your and my life has been determined through the forces of reward and punishment. Everything that we know about ourselves and the world and our lived experience, when you pause and you zoom out, it just I kind of do that now for a moment, has been determined by reward and punishment. And I'm not saying that reward and punishment are good or bad. No, right? They're very effective. The question that I'm asking is, who determined the boundaries of which behaviors and identities we reward and which we punish? And why is it that reward and punishment are so effective as a way to nudge our behaviors, our identities, the choices that we make? Because our brains love reward. They are designed to eat up the reward, right? It gives us a certain chemical reaction. And as a result, we also hate punishment. So everything, even about our physiology, our body, our makeup, is designed for you to chase the reward and to avoid the punishment. So again, I'm not saying that reward and punishment is good or bad. I'm saying it is very effective. The question I'm asking us is this: who decided which behaviors and identities do we reward and which we punish? This is the question we're asking. Who determined the boundaries, the playbook of which identities and behaviors we reward and which we punish? Take a breath, because this is when we start moving into some of the stuff around identity and power. The boundaries of reward and punishment have been determined by dominant ideology, by a history of violence within the human experience, of dominant groups who have unfortunately inflicted violence, both physical and psychological, on groups to create a social hierarchy of who is better and who is worse. And when we're looking at what dominant ideology is, who has determined the boundaries of which identities and behaviors we reward and punish, we are looking at men, we are looking at white people, we're looking at straight people or heterosexuality, heteronormativity. We're looking at Christianity. We're looking at the English speaking or the English language. We're looking at being able-bodied. We're looking at being upper income. Dominant ideology has created, or rather has imprinted upon society, the rule books of which behaviors we reward and which we punish. What is a good boy? What is a bad girl? What is a happy marriage? What is an unhappy marriage? What does it mean to have a normal life? What is a life of sin? Everything about the boundaries of our lives and reward and punishment have been determined by dominant ideology. And what this does, right? What this does, this dominant ideology that all of us, you and I, are subjected to, is that if we are outside of what it is those boundaries are, if our identity or the behaviors we wish to demonstrate or what it is that we think is fair is outside of what dominant ideology says is worth reward and which is, and thus must now be punished to get in line, it's going to have a real psychological effect on us, on you and me. We're going to constantly be disapproved and alienated and pushed against if I'm being told that this is what a good woman is, but I don't necessarily agree with that. Or this is how you speak beautiful English in order to get there. Like, we're going to constantly have an assault on our psychology, constantly being told that we're not enough, right? That we are not valuable, that we are sinners, that we are abnormal, that you need to be this in order to get more, that only when you're here will you be happy, only when you're close to this and you speak English like this, or you're not too flamboyant than this, or you are not so manly. All of it is wrapped up in a dominant ideology to sustain an old way of being. And what this does, the effects of the reward and punishment that exist within society, it has two deep effects. First one is it limits our identity and expression. All of us have our own identity and how it is we express that identity, being it our racial identity, our gender identity, our sexual identity, our physical identity, whatever it is. And what this script of which behaviors and identities we reward and punish that we've given in society, it limits everyone's ability to express that. We all have to express it within the lines of what it is that has been socially accepted and what it is that we've been told to do. So this idea of reward and punishment really limits our ability to find our identity, to express our identity, and to develop an identity. And then lastly, and I think this is the most important one, or the most painful one, is what this reward and punishment based on a dominant ideology does is it conflates, or it joins, or it brings together your identity and your self-worth. It says that you are only valuable when you are good according to this rule book. And if you are not according to this rule book, you're bad and you're going to be punished. And you know what you and I do? We internalize it. We make it our shame, right? We make it our shame. We make it, I must be bad. I must not be good enough. I must be the wrong. I must be abnormal. And that's kind of part of what it is diversity and inclusion and psychological safety is all about, and belonging is all about. Because racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, ableism, Islamophobia, all of those elements, right? It is definitely the idea of political exclusion. It excludes people economically and it excludes people socially, sure. But the big one for me, the big one that we need to be discussing is really sexism, racism, homophobia, Islamophobia, transphobia, all of that stuff is an assault on an individual's psychology. There's a psychological exclusion, an internalizing of our own badness that I maybe even deserve punishment. So what we'll do to try and avoid the pain of punishment, we'll try and change to try and get as close to the identity and the behaviors in order to get the reward, even if it means putting who it is that you are on the shelf or staying in the closet, to use a Pride Month reference. And the pain of that, right? The internal tension and trauma of that, right? The fight of that takes a toll on our mental and our physical wellness. Right, takes a toll on our mental and physical wellness. So when we are thinking about psychological safety and the idea of belonging, we all searching for belonging, we need it. But what happens when the script, the boundaries of whether to belong means I have to change my identity in order to seem like I belong in this pride of lions when actually I am a hyena? But we're so frightened to be the hyena, we change to try to be this lion, and that causes a sense of dysfunction. We need to be challenging the boundaries of what belonging is and who set the boundaries of what it means to belong and what it means to not belong, and how we can start sharing resources outside of these very closed communities of belonging. Because the thing that we are actually craving, the thing that belonging truly gives to us, that idea of safety and access, is the sense of psychological safety. When we belong, when we can be who we are without the fear of punishment, that is a psychologically safe space. It's a moment when I can build a better quality relationship, both with myself and my own dissonance and my own identity and my own psychology, and I can heal my own trauma and my own pain, but I can also celebrate my difference. That is beauty, that is safety. And that can often only happen when we are in spaces of where we belong. Psychological safety is also about having a quality of relationship with others. What happens if I don't feel safe with other people because they keep using slurs, or I just don't feel like this person gets me? I can't be my true self within that space because I need better relationships. I need this relationship to be one of trust. Psychological safety is also about a relationship with power, a relationship with spaces, right? Do I feel comfortable going to a golf course, or do I feel comfortable going to the Virgin Active men's change room, right? We have a relationship with spaces. Some spaces don't make us feel safe and we can't explain it, but we just feel like it's a wide space or a straight space or whatever it is. Psychological safety is an experience that we have within our bodies of safety, right? And belonging is an experience that happens within our bodies. It's a feeling of safety. So the question that I'm coming with, and really this is like a roundabout way to talk about this question, because I said I'm actually coming with more questions than I am answers. Let me just quickly go to the questions that I'm asking is this. Give me a second. Okay, there we are. The question that I'm asking today, or tonight at least, is this. Do I need to belong in order to feel safe? So do I need to belong in a community in order to feel safe? Or is it the other way around? Do I need to feel safe in order to then experience belonging? Or is the feeling of belonging also one of safety? I don't want you guys in your professional lives to buy into the idea that belonging is this, and then it's psychological safety, and then it's justice, and da-da-da. I want us to think about the human experience in a world that has told us how to be, where some people are automatically seen as valuable and some not, and we have to constantly shift our identities and our behaviors in order to try belong. And what is that experience like? The exhaustion that takes up. And instead of us trying to find fresh language, maybe we can just start centralizing the human experience of not belonging, of psychological exclusion, right? So we can start challenging spaces and organizations and relationships, and also even create the space where we are looking at our own dissonance and disconnection and saying, who am I, right? Who am I? So yes, we all want to belong. We are driven by the need to belong. But sometimes to belong, it means we have to shelve really important parts of ourselves, because the boundaries, the rule book of who can and cannot belong within a space is sometimes predetermined long before us. And then where does that leave us? Diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging work, for me, is about challenging the rule book of power, challenging the scripts of what behaviors and identities we reward and punish, challenge the questions of belonging. So when we're driving belonging in an organization, I'm always like, but wait, do we really want to belong to this? Do we even know what it is we're belonging to? So let's just kind of think about that as we enjoy the next presentation from Veronica, who's a seasoned expert within this field. So I'm really excited to hear from her. But this was really just kind of an intro for us to be thinking about the emotional, psychological, but also kind of this inherited rule book that tries to shape who it is that we are. I'm super excited for a Q&A, so I'm going to stick around. But thank you so much for this opportunity to engage everyone on this wonderful Monday, but cold night. Thank you.
Wow, Roy, thank you so much. That was really amazing. A great send-off for me, so to speak. So good evening, everybody, and thank you for being here. And it's lovely to be dancing with you again, Roy. I'm Veronica King, and I am the founder and the CEO of embody Consulting. And I'm really honored to be invited by SACAP to come and share my thoughts on diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, or maybe the more broader topic of transformation. And following on from Roy's powerful talk about psychological safety, what I thought would be a good sort of follow on from that would be, so how do we embody diversity, equity, and inclusion every day? And I'm pleased that Roy has spoken a lot about what happens in our body, the actual somatic or visceral impact that we have on certain things. So yes, so speaking about how do we embody diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, and I thought it would be a brilliant segue, because speaking about the somatic experience about which Roy has been speaking, that happens in our bodies, you know, whether it's about the reward or whether it's about the punishment, whether we're walking into a room where we are not represented, there is something that happens in our bodies. There's a somatic impact. There is a visceral impact when we are not being represented. And again, that representation, what's at the bottom of that is, do we feel that we actually belong in this environment? There's nobody that looks like me or sounds like me. And that's the feeling that we're wanting to talk about today. So I just think it's so important that we start recognizing what is happening in our bodies. So I thought I would speak about embodying. How do we embody diversity, equity, and inclusion every day? Because it really requires a lot of commitment. It requires a huge amount of self-reflection, constantly being aware, and the self-awareness will help our self-regulation in certain contexts, and that's why the self-reflection is so important. Needless to say, ongoing learning. We don't know everything. The curiosity of understanding and knowing other people who are different from us in whatever way, and as we know, the diversity markers, the depth and breadth of those are endless. So ongoing learning about people who are different from us really enable us to start feeling a sense of belonging that Roy's been speaking about. And also it's really important about being intentional. And I often speak about how important it is to be intentional, deliberate, and proactive when we do stuff, because with the absence of the pure intentionality, we can come across as being insincere or performative, which could be even more impactful and offensive to someone who is different from us if we think we're just going to be saying something to sound that we know what we're talking about. The next slide, please, Stephanie. That's what I was wanting not to keep saying, the next slide. So I thought I'd put this together. We spoke about practical terms, as Roy said. He had wonderful questions on which we can keep chewing and talking about. I thought it would be lovely just for us to maybe speak about a few steps of embodying. And I think for me, the word embody is actually how do we be what we're talking about? Because whether it's joy or whether it's sadness, we feel it deep in our bodies. And speaking about our history, as Roy said, diversity, equity, inclusion, justice, belonging, all of these things are what can be seen as one big cluster, and its history, it's a lot about our history, especially in the South African context. And whatever we had internalized from those playbooks and from the way Roy described it, sits in our bodies. And if we can start becoming aware of what is happening in our bodies, that's where the healing can start happening, and perhaps the more inclusion and the more openness it is. So the first thing that I wanted to speak about is how do we educate ourselves? So these are the steps that I come up with, and the first of those is educating yourself. And why do I say that? For the longest time, I'm not going to date myself, I'm not going to tell you how old I am, but I do know that I started work in a very long time ago, and I often was the only Black person in many contexts. I started in an industry that was completely white, and I was possibly the first or one of the first Black people in that context. And what constantly made me aware of my difference is the questions I was asked. I was asked, oh, so how do you wash your hair? And what do you do with your hair at night? And do you get tanned when you're in the sun? And And those questions really made me feel that, reminded me that I was really different. So that is why I'm ever so passionate about us educating ourselves. The intention of those questions are possibly really pure and innocent, one can say, but it really can be quite offensive. You know, Roy has touched on June being Pride Month, and the many questions around LGBTQI+ at the moment are quite ubiquitous. Some of them are very inclusive, and there's still comments that are very exclusive. So if we can start educating ourselves, doing research, attending webinars, well done for being here this evening, reading about things, because then we don't need to be othering people by asking them questions, you know. Regarding Pride Month as well, I often cringe when I hear narratives about, why are these young children choosing to be trans? That question in itself is so revealing, that somebody who's asking a question like that has not even taken time to understand what is happening, but coming from the heteronormative privilege that, you know, most of the world operates from a heteronormative privilege, heterosexual privilege perspective. So educating ourselves, and I find one of the best ways of educating ourselves is how diverse are our social groups. Do we have relationships outside of work? You know, I always say we are forced to work with people who are different from us in the workplace because it's legislated. You know, there's a legislation, we speak about EE and BEE. So we're forced to work with people who don't look like us. But sadly, I think most of us still live very segregated lives. And I find the best way to really educate ourselves is by ensuring that we have diverse friendships. That way, we can identify what we have in common. I always say, finding common ground is when true transformation really happens. The level of comfort we would gain by knowing what we have in common will enable us to speak about our differences without fear of judgment. So I can't overemphasize how important educating ourselves on all the different diversity markers, whether it's about race, whether it's about gender, language, culture, tradition, sexual orientation, all of these wonderful topics. Let's educate ourselves, and that would be one of the easiest ways of truly embodying DEI. So the next slide, please. Self-reflection, what do I mean by that? And again, we all have biases. We all have been informed and influenced by our upbringing, by our families, by our communities, society, media, school, church, a whole lot of things. So the more we actually know ourselves, many people are strangers to themselves. How do we keep ourselves close to ourselves? By really engaging in our own self-reflection and becoming aware of our beliefs, our values, our identity. And when we actually are aware of those things, we can then become aware of, oh, my assumption of that person who looks like that is based on what my mum used to say or what my dad used to say. And how do we challenge ourselves to really start testing these assumptions and not having them completely rule our lives and inform our lenses in the way we see everything and shape our worldview? So the self-reflection piece is critically important if we truly are wanting to embody diversity, equity, and inclusion with the intention of really creating inclusive environments wherever we are. So I'm going to move on to the next one, which is active listening. Why do I say active listening? We know what's it like when somebody is not listening to us. It's not a good feeling. And the way we can truly start embracing diversity is by listening attentively, listening to understand the lived experience of the other, listening to the non-verbal cues of what is happening with the other. We can tell, just today I was actually running a listening skills module for one of my clients, and I was reminded in my presentation today that 55% of facial expressions is what people are actually listening to when we are speaking. So in the context of embodying diversity, we can learn so much with the quality of attention and listening to people, especially when we're listening to people who are different from us, whether they're from a different country, a different race, a different gender, whatever it is. And that level of listening will really enable us to understand and gain meaning about the person who's different from us. And it's also about listening for different perspectives. That's piece that's all a part of educating ourselves as well, so that we don't ask these absolute othering questions, because they can be so offensive. And those biases can also, those othering questions speak about our stereotype thoughts, our biases, and we know that our biases can also unintentionally lead to a microaggression. So without listening attentively, we could ask the wrong question that could be quite offensive. So listening actively is really important, and especially listening and giving space to marginalized voices. Now, we spoke about those dominant ideologies. In all of our different work contexts, there's more often than not a dominant dynamic that is happening. So how do we become aware of the voices that are silenced? And that would be more often than not, it will be the out group or the marginalized voices. And if we genuinely actively listening, we'd be able to hear and invite the marginalized voices in, because that's where the wisdom of many systems lies. If we speak about what's the word I'm looking for? Deep democracy. Deep democracy suggests when we listen for the no in the room, that is where the wisdom lies. So I'm going to move on to how do we embrace diversity. And embracing diversity, again, is about seeking out the diverse perspectives, diverse voices, and diverse experiences. If we have a certain privilege, we sometimes can assume that everybody's worldview is the same as mine. And I often find some of my white friends who feel offended if other white people start speaking to them in rather pejorative ways about Black and brown people, assuming that, oh, they're white, we have the same view. And it would be the same for heterosexual people. So let's really be curious in a respectful way of understanding difference. And that's what diversity really means. It means how do we recognize, acknowledge, and respect difference. And obviously in the context of work, it also speaks about, it's the metrics, it's the numbers, it's the compliance piece. But embracing diversity, again, is so important about our social relationships. I still find makes it a lot more comfortable for me to be aware. It educates I educate myself by my diverse group, and that's what enables me to really embrace diversity, knowing different backgrounds, different lived experience, different perspectives, different voices. That's the richness and the deliciousness of diversity, as I often say. I like that alliteration, delicious diversity. And then, how further do we embody it? By being an advocate. Being an advocate and an ally, and speaking up when something is being said that is not serving someone in the group or the context or the team that we're in. And I want to just say how important it is that it is not performative allyship. What do I mean by that? So during May 2020, when the 25th of May, when George Floyd was lynched, the Black Lives Movement really became pervasive, rightly so. It had always been a movement. It was amplified because of the brutality that had happened. And everybody suddenly was standing up against what had happened, rightly so. However, there were a few comments that I read on my social media timelines from my friends, lots of my white friends that I've known, and their comments were very performative, and they were wanting to be supportive, and they were wanting to be an ally. But I just found it even more offensive when it's not sincere and genuine, and it's being forced. Like, as we know, anything that is not sincere or authentic is overdone and it's forced. It actually causes more harm than good. So speaking up and being an advocate, standing against any kind of discrimination, any kind of racism, injustice, inequity, we need that. As a Black woman, I have to say, there have been many contexts where I have been able to just breathe because I've been so impacted by a comment that's made at a dinner party, and there's nothing better than if it's an offensive comment that's been made by a white person, and bless them, it's not intentional at times. And then for me to respond to that, sometimes I get so winded by the comment, and I'd like to think that I'm never short of words or a good retort. But there are times when you hear comments that you think like, did they just say that? And those are the moments when my white friends really step up and just ask, Veronica, would you mind if I respond to that? What I appreciate about that approach, they ask me if they can respond, because what can happen when we are being an advocate or an ally, we can center ourselves, which actually silences the person we want to be an ally for even more. So the sensitivity and the sincerity of the type of advocate and ally we are is very important, because we certainly know, I know for sure, there have been many situations where I've needed an ally. And as a woman, having a male speak up in a board meeting, when I say something and it's just ignored, a male board member says something, the same thing, and it's applauded, I need a good male ally in that boardroom to say, but hang on, that's exactly what Veronica said a minute ago. What's the difference with you saying it, Trevor, compared to what Veronica? So those are moments where it kind of really helps have somebody having their hand on your back and being your ally. So I think that's one of a wonderful way as well of embodying. How do we recognize what our privilege is and using that privilege for good, to be an advocate and an ally for the other who might not have the same or enjoy the same privilege. I'll say more about that momentarily when I get to that slide. So let's move on. Fostering inclusion, I've touched on that already. The more we embody our diversity, our equity, and our belonging and justice, the more we can foster inclusive relationships. There's nothing worse than being at any event or function where you can tell that sense of belonging about which Roy spoke is not there, but then it takes somebody to be an ally, to welcome you without making you feel weird, but really sincerely, warmly welcoming you into a context. So how do we actively create and involve people who are different to really create equality and create equal opportunities? And I think fostering a sense of belonging, fostering inclusion is at the heart of what we're wanting to achieve with the work that Roy and I are doing with diversity, equity, and inclusion. And then much like educating ourselves, continuous learning and growth is really important. How do we embrace a growth mindset? How do we read things that are different? And again, that's another lovely thing. So often in my work that I do, I will have a module and there might be a week or two between another module on a diversity journey. And I will challenge people for their own continuous learning and growth is to do something different. Read a different newspaper, listen to a different radio station so that you can start recognizing different perspectives when you're out there. So how do we stay up to date with current issues, research, best practice, and constantly being open to feedback? I don't know everything. I've been doing this work for about 20 years. There we go. I'm dating myself. Roy said he's doing it for a decade. That's a little bit of an expose. Maybe we'll have a guess my age quiz. But yes, constantly learning. And I've been doing this work passionately since I've been back in South Africa for 20 years. And I still learn and grow all the time. So the information that is available to us on the internet, there is no excuse for us asking an inappropriate question when we can educate ourselves and take our continuous and learning and growth seriously. And then it's about, what are we doing? Enough talk, take action. So how do we really focus on taking action? More and more, we're speaking about how do we move from aspiration and awareness to action? How do we move from the theory, diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, justice, social justice? We've been bashing our gums about this and reading and hearing about it since post-94, to be honest. What are we doing about it? Why is the action so slow in coming? I become very curious when I see the absence of action. It suggests a number of things. It suggests resistance to change, the level of comfort. Some people don't need to change and their lives will just continue. Most of us have to see the change because we're wanting to make a change. I know I do this work really passionately to make a different reality for my daughter, for her generation. The thought of my daughter still begging to be seen, begging to be heard, begging for her value to be recognized. I just can't tell you. The thought of that brings me to tears. So I really do this work with an action-focused way of doing it so that we can create a different reality for our children, for the next generation, and for their children. And then I want to also speak about, I think, my final slide. How am I doing for time? Am I being kicked off yet?
No, you.
Am I doing okay? Thanks, Stephanie. It's about really acknowledging and accepting your privilege and using it for good. What do I mean by that? In the context of diversity and equity and inclusion, and maybe I should actually say, as soon as the word diversity is heard, more often than not, the immediate association is race and gender. We know that those are very, very important still, but there are many other areas of other dimensions of diversity. And there's also, and because race is often the one that's immediately associated with diversity, and given our history, what happens? We think about black and white. And when we think about black and white, we immediately then go into that binary, that white privilege is the thing, whites were in front of the queue for everything. And we know that whiteness has been marketed as the standard of beauty, of intelligence, the writers of knowledge, the holders of knowledge, sophistication, all of these things. Again, it's that dominant ideology of white supremacy. Pardon me touching my nose, not very attractive. But when we become aware that white privilege is not just it's about the whiteness. It's an unearned privilege. When we recognize, because it can make some white people very defensive, and I hope I'm not triggering anybody on the call, because I also want to say that white privilege is not about wealth. And acknowledging white privilege also doesn't suggest that whites don't have hard times, have challenging times, have financial difficulties, and all of the things that go in with this human experience. The focus is the whiteness of one's skin, which is unearned, which is given preferential treatment in most contexts internationally, globally. There are other privileges, though. I'm a Black woman. I've got heterosexual privilege. So acknowledging and accepting my heterosexual privilege enables me to be a sincere, not performative, advocate and ally for the LGBTQIA+ community. I've also got able-bodied privilege. How do I use that to be the person that challenges discrimination against people living with disabilities? That's the role I can play. So if we all can acknowledge what our privilege is, instead of being defensive about it, if we acknowledge it and embrace it, we will be able to use it for good. And these are the ways in which we can embody and be the words, because we've been speaking it all the time. You know, I often refer to head, heart, and hands as well when we're talking about transformation. It's not just a theory thing. It's not just a cerebral thing. How are we feeling? And that's when we speak about going below the waterline on the iceberg. Look at our beliefs and our values that have informed our biases and challenge ourselves so that we can be true citizens of inclusion and creating belonging. So I think that's my last slide. Am I right? Oh, I have another actually, just a wrap-up slide. So I've created these steps to really speak about how could we practically and intentionally, deliberately, and proactively really act on these wonderful words that we all sort of sprouting about all the time. So remember that embodying DEI is an ongoing journey, and I'm a lifelong learner. I learn every day. That requires consistent effort and self-reflection, being close to yourself, understanding why our worldview is the way it is, being aware and sensitive of how that might be impacting others, that is completely against inclusion, will really start helping us take steps and integrating DEI principles in our daily lives so that we can all contribute to creating more inclusive, equitable society. Thank you so much for listening to me. And I look forward to maybe there might be a few questions pelted at me and Roy, and I'd be only too delighted to hear those. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks. Thanks so much, Veronica and Roy. I think everybody on this call has definitely learned a lot. I think any expectations we might have had coming into this session have definitely been blown out of the water. It was very insightful, very engaging. Okay, Veronica, we do have a question for you. Robin says, I find it interesting that you still apologize to white people about using the term white privilege. Can you explain why?
So my apology, a lovely question. I want to be very clear that I'm not a white apologist at all. But what I apologize for is triggering people. When I'm sharing information, I'm sharing my sincere lived experience, and I do know that sometimes people can be triggered by the term white privilege. I've been doing this work for 20 years, as I say, and still today, there will be somebody who turns red in a workshop when I speak about white privilege, and the immediate narrative is, my parents came here with just one box, so we are not privileged. And that's why I apologize that if anybody is taking offense, stay with me, because I'm not speaking about wealth. I'm speaking about the unearned privilege of one's white skin that enables you access to places that I would never be able to have access. That's the reason. So I want to bottom line and say that I am not a white apologist at all. I'm very mindful of how I speak and what I say, and nothing that I say is to perpetuate white comfort. If anything, it's an invitation for self-reflection. That's the intention I hold. It's an invitation for self-reflection when I name things that many people will not be able to name. Thank you for the question. I'm hoping it's answered adequately.
Thanks, Veronica.
If I can just add to that, to Robin's question, being in the diversity, equity, inclusion, or transformation space is strategic, right? Or rather, you need to be strategic in the space. There is, and Veronica knows this, I think, better than anyone, there is a fine line between being invited back and being totally iced out. Like, it is part, I often see this as like one of my big responsibilities when I come in to do a client session is to ensure that we get session 2 and then hopefully 3 and 4, because learning happens progressively. So when we are using particular wording, when we are kind of creating a safe space, which sometimes can seem like mollycoddling, what we are doing is we are, of course, there's always that check, like, am I actually mollycoddling whiteness or masculinity or heteronormativity? But then there's also the strategic component of learning, and that is people learn best when they feel safe. So there's this tension that exists in this work always, and that's what makes it quite fun and very challenging, because you're like, how do I come in, not too intense? You know, Roy can come in more intense than Veronica, but Veronica can't always come in too intense, because then there's a whole bunch of labels that attach to her body. So there's this weird interplay, you know. I think, I don't know about, I won't speak for Veronica, I'll speak for me. My goal is to prioritize learning, and I want to create a space where people feel like they can learn. And so we kind of massage the space a little bit. We get to that point where people trust us, so we can actually get to some of the root stuff.
Lovely. Thank you for building on that, Roy.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I think that was lovely. Thank you so much, both of you, for your insight on that. We do have another question, Veronica. I think this is for you, seeing as you did out yourself. What changes have you personally seen in people after doing this for 20 years? And I think, Roy, being in the same space, perhaps you could also share your experiences there.
So the changes, wow. So I think the change is about awareness. I think people are definitely a lot more aware, and that is why I'm constantly challenging, how do we move from awareness to action? It's not good enough that you say that I've got a gay friend, but you're still asking ridiculous questions. That reminds me of, at my AGM in my complex last week, somebody made a really offensive comment about Pride Month, and they said that's because they were Christian. And when I challenged her, she then said, I have a gay friend. And then she went on to say, but this LBB thing, and I'm like, okay. So it was just kind of, again, so there is awareness, but it's really, people have internalized these messages and the programming from these dominant ideologies so deeply, and holding them over the edge of really trying to find and look at those beliefs and values and how they've internalized either their superiority or inferiority is deep, deep work. So changes have happened. We're seeing a lot more representation where people of color were not even expected. There's a lot more change in that way. But we're still a long, long, long way to go. I think one of the best testimonials that I received from a big law firm that I'm doing this work in, and from one of the senior partners, he just said, Veronica, you have changed something inside of me and of others. And I was tearful reading that feedback, because it's hard to really put your finger on the change, because we're asking people to really look at themselves. You know, it's not like saying, go and sell 10 cell phones and what's the result? You know, it's such deep work. And as we know, most people don't go to therapy because it's so deep and painful. And doing this work also takes a lot of deep emotional work. So I can't give you stats of how it's changed, but my optimism and feedback like the one I've just shared, I'm feeling that there is a lot of change, but there could be a lot more change if people really just did that internal transformation work. Do you want to build on that, Roy?
Sure, totally. I mean, let's just look at the Apple Vision Pro, right, as a really good example, right? This release of this new Apple product. Like there are Gen Zs or people who are 15 years old and younger now, who would probably say, like, we haven't seen much technological change in our lifetime, right? And now we look at AI and Apple Vision Pro, and we see it as like, wow, a real step in change for people who haven't necessarily been living for more than 15, 20 years. But when you ask, let's say, Veronica or even me, how much technological change has happened in your lifetime, we're like, oh gosh, like we used to have a landline, right? So what's interesting about this idea of change is that for people who are much younger, are born into a society where the standard of technological advancement is already here. So it doesn't look like we're doing these big jumps. But when we actually zoom out, there has been a huge amount of change. Like even just the conversation around LGBT and Pride Month, like just the experience for queer people generally is incredible. So I think what's interesting about society is that it always pendulums, right? From more conservative to more liberal, from politically correct Obama to anti-woke Trump. And this gives us the feeling sometimes that there is no change, right? Because we kind of move, so it feels like we're going backwards and forwards. But it was Martin Luther King who spoke about the moral arc of society. It's like the moral arc of society is long, but it always bends toward justice. So yes, we are penduluming, but we're actually moving within this orbit towards a more conscious space. So even now we kind of have this conservative shift. It doesn't mean we're going backwards. We're kind of moving along this slow arc. So I think there has been huge change in the consciousness and the awareness. Have our structures changed? Not really that much. Is it in the process? Yeah. So I think change is deeply complex, but there has absolutely been change. But how do we kind of zoom out and kind of see the penduluming, but also the arc and understand it contextually? But I mean, Veronica knows my thoughts on change and kind of sometimes feeling quite jaded by it. Like maybe nothing will ever change systemically. I don't know. We'll find out.
Lovely. Thanks so much for those in-depth answers. It's very insightful, I think, for myself as well as everybody on this call. We do have another question. So do you think that we've even begun to scratch the surface when it comes to unconscious bias? I think this would, purely be a personal experience and opinion in this sense.
Roy?
Well, what is unconscious bias? Unconscious bias for me are the automatic. Unconscious bias for me is who we've been taught or who we have caught to automatically see as safe, familiar, valuable, likable. Okay, so, and that's that societal rule book, who we've automatically been taught or have caught to see as automatically safe, familiar, valuable, likable. Those are the things for me. So I think that the only way we start scratching the surface of unconscious bias is when we start to dismantle who it is we automatically see as safe, familiar, valuable, likable. And I think we have seen that absolutely in terms of women's role in the workplace, women in leadership. Even if we're just thinking about like the rise of the conversation of neurodivergence, which is an unconscious bias challenge. So I think that there is, of course, a huge amount of work to do, but I do think that the conversation around unconscious bias and the way we speak about it needs to shift. Like I went down a rabbit hole of like e-learning programs on unconscious bias, and I was just appalled by the basic, really inaccessible way to learn. It's like, know your bias and like, don't have this affinity bias. It's like not good. So have we begun to scratch the surface? I think we've like reached a cap in terms of like socializing the language. Like now everyone knows about it, but I don't think we've like fully unpacked where it comes from, why it exists, what it's about. So I do think we need like another round, but you'll see what will happen in this category. We'll call it something else, right? Like microaggressions is having its moment. So it's like, oh, okay, we must do microaggressions. And it's like, okay, cool. Like microaggressions is all part of the same, you know, so it's about these moments and it's about new language and we come back to the same thing. So I think unconscious bias is an experience of value, which is what exclusion is, which is what inclusion is, which is what belonging is. So for me, it's all the same stuff. We just package in different ways. And for me as a provider, we kind of move with whatever people want, but really we're doing the same stuff. And that is, let's check who it is we automatically see as valuable. Okay, we want to call it inclusion, belonging, unconscious bias, let's do it. But let's do it. So yeah, that's just another roundabout answer, which seems to be my way tonight.
Veronica, anything?
There's nothing to add. I think Roy has really kind of encapsulated my thoughts in what he responded with.
Lovely. We have another one for you, Veronica. And I think, again, Roy, experience in this space, you're always welcome to share as well. So I'm assuming Petunia was actually speaking about if an institution doesn't have a diversity policy, what would they need to consider in making a diversity policy? Possibly in the workspace or any space, I think.
Petunia, that's a big, big question. And there isn't one thing. You know, a diversity policy document can be at its smallest 40 pages. So asking what to consider to put in there is quite a lengthy, and I've just been appointed as the Anti-Racism and Diversity Ombudsman for a big global organization. And that's my first project, is looking at their anti-racism policy and their diversity policy. It's really, there's so many things. So Petunia, I'm not avoiding the question. I honestly don't know where to start.
Okay. We have another question that says, how do you deal with those who deflect from the topic and want to discuss something else? For example, you talk about transformation in agriculture and they bring in the fact that white people will leave the country.
I'm going to give it to my trusted Roy companion today.
Yes.
You know,
I'll build on it after you, Roy.
Yeah. I think it's a really great question. I think my experience around talking about equality or equity, which is at the heart of transformation, that it's very rarely a conceptual or a logical conversation, right? Because you guys have all seen that picture of the three people at the baseball game, and the three of them are standing on the same box, but the tall one can see and the shortest one can't see, and then they give the one box and they give it to the short one. And it was like, yes, that's equity. Wonderful. We all agree with it. Yes, obviously we all want to do that. That makes absolute sense. But you know what? This is not a rational conversation. It's emotional. Because when you start taking boxes away from people, they're saying, but what about my children? So for me, it's like my approach really is, how do we hold the space for that deflection? You know, let's talk about your fears of white people leaving. Let's talk about your children, white people. Let's talk about your boy who's now going to be seen as trash his whole life. Like, let's actually talk about that. Let's create that space. And again, that's not necessarily space that Veronica has or needs to be creating, but I'll hold that space. Like, let's talk about it. Like, let's bring it in. And I actually find that when we start acknowledging the anxiety, when we start acknowledging the fear, when we start acknowledging the emotion, and we provide a space to work through it, we can kind of get to a point where we start having the conversation that we need to be having, right? But it takes a bit of a skilled facilitation. It takes a lot of patience. It takes a lot of empathy to create that space. What we know, right, is that calling people out isn't going to change society, or else social media would have revolutionized the world. It doesn't. Of course, we have big academics talking about calling in and what that means. But similarly, this idea of deflection is sometimes just a communication, like, I'm really scared to go here. And for me, I love fear. I love that. I'm like, okay, let's do it. Like, let's actually hold this. So I think as a strategic process, let's create more spaces where white people, where men, where straight people can say, I'm scared to be called a racist or a sexist or a homophobe. I'm terrified that I'm not going to have any opportunities. I'm scared that South Africa's got to. Let's hold that space. And then we must move through it, right? And then we got to move. We can't kind of sit in that and be like, great, what a wonderful session. We need to kind of move through that. But I do think, and like I could show you a little kind of model that I was created, was that behavior change is not about telling people to say, do, and think things differently, right? Then if that were the case, no one would smoke, no one would drink, no one would eat fast food, no one would drive fast. Like if we told people what to do, they'd do it. Behavior change is actually about creating the space for people to look at their feelings and ultimately their beliefs. So to kind of say, oh, your belief and your feeling is invalid or isn't important, we're never going to create behavior change. So let's go hold that space, and then we must be moving through that space.
Thank you, Roy. And I just want to add to that, I think when a topic is being avoided, it's immediate information for me. It's telling me something. It's telling me that they're fearful. It could be telling me that they want to be centered. Everything is about them. And that's also an invitation for me to have more compassion. You know, I would never be able to do this work if I didn't have compassion and empathy. So holding people in that fear and creating a space for them to be vulnerable and speak about those fears can really enable more honest conversation. Because I do think often people also evade the conversation because they feel so edgy and so awkward. They don't have the language to name things and they're scared of offending. And we often hear that. Or I'm scared to speak to gay people. I don't know how to speak to them. Or I'm scared to engage Black people at the event. I might say something. And that awkwardness makes them say something that offends the other. So how do we create the space and a container that invites them and acknowledge what's happening? And as Roy says, telling them to change their behavior is not going to change their behavior, because our emotions, our feeling drive our behavior. So if we can invite them to be in touch with what is happening below the surface, what's happening below the fear, might be a way of getting them to engage more meaningfully.
Yeah, that was our last question for the evening. So I'd just like to thank you, Roy and Veronica, for your insight, for sharing with us. You've seen the lovely comments from our attendees this evening who found the session as insightful as I have. And just our attendees for staying on this call with us this evening. Thank you for joining. Thank you for your questions. And once again, a huge thank you to everybody. I hope you have a lovely evening further. And if you are in South Africa, stay warm. Take care. Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Thank
you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.